The phone call came at 10:30 in the morning, interrupting the chef's usual routine. He had been prepping for the lunch rush, moving through the kitchen with the kind of efficiency that had become second nature. As the phone rang, he paused for a moment, wiping his hands on his apron before picking it up. The voice on the other end was one he recognized all too well, the owner of the restaurant. "Can you come in for a quick meeting?" "It's urgent," the owner said, his tone colder than usual. The chef's mind raced. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to mask the concern that was creeping up his spine. There had been no prior warning, no indication that anything was wrong. He had been a model employee, always on time, always delivering. He couldn't imagine what would necessitate a meeting. "I'll explain when you get here." "Just come in," the owner insisted. Within minutes, the chef arrived at the restaurant, his mind filled with questions. As he entered the back door, he noticed that the usual hum of activity was quieter than normal. The cooks, servers, and dishwashers were all working, but there was an unease in the air that he couldn't place. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The owner was sitting in the small office off the main kitchen, looking as serious as ever. His face, usually so calm and collected, now looked strained, almost apologetic. "Take a seat," the owner said, motioning to the chair across from him. The chef hesitated for a moment before sitting down, trying to steady his breath. He had no idea what was coming. "I don't know how to say this, but," the owner's voice faltered for a moment, then steadied. "I'm going to have to let you go. Effective immediately." The words hit like a slap in the face. The chef blinked, his mind trying to process what he had just heard. He felt a rush of confusion. This couldn't be happening. What, was all he could manage to say. His voice was barely a whisper, as though he feared speaking too loudly might make it all real. "I'm sorry," the owner said, avoiding his gaze. "It's not personal. The business has been going through some changes. We need to make cuts, and unfortunately, you're one of them." The chef's chest tightened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. There had been no warning, no discussion about any issues with his performance. He had been there for years, working his way up from the bottom, earning the respect of his peers and customers. This was not the way it was supposed to end. "I don't understand," he said, his voice shaking now. "Why me? What did I do wrong?" The owner hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. "Nothing personal. Just business decisions. We have to make some tough calls." The chef sat there, stunned, as the owner pushed a severance package across the table. He felt a wave of anger rush through him, followed by a sinking feeling in his stomach. How could this happen? How could he be fired without any explanation, without any chance to defend himself? He stood up slowly, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. "I've worked here for years. You just let me go without any warning? What about all the loyalty, the hours, the effort I put into this place?" His voice was low but sharp, filled with disbelief. The owner didn't respond. He just sat there, looking as if he wanted to say something else, but couldn't find the words. After a long moment of silence, the chef turned and walked out of the office, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a dull thud. Outside, the world seemed different. The streets were busy, people were hustling, but everything felt muted to him. The bright sunshine, the sound of passing cars, even the smell of the city, everything felt distant, as if he were seeing it all through a foggy window. He didn't know what to do next. He had no plan. No backup. All he knew was that his life had just been upended, and he had no idea why. As he walked down the street, still holding the severance check in his hand, his mind wandered. Was it something he had done? Had he missed something? Or was there something deeper going on that he didn't understand? What was worse, he didn't know who to ask. No one in the kitchen had given any indication that he was in trouble. His coworkers seemed as surprised as he was when the news spread. It was as though it had come out of nowhere. And then, the unsettling thought crept into his mind, could it be because of who he was? Could race have played a role in his firing? The idea gnawed at him, but he couldn't be sure. There had been no overt signs, but the more he thought about it, the more he began to question the decisions that had led to his dismissal. Was there something more to this than just business? The questions weighed heavily on his mind as he walked aimlessly down the street, the weight of the day's events sinking in. He had been fired for no reason. And now, his life would never be the same. The days after being fired blurred together. The chef had always been someone who thrived on routine, but now, with the rhythm of his life suddenly disrupted, he felt lost. Every morning, he woke up to an empty apartment, a stark contrast to the bustling kitchen where he had spent most of his waking hours. He didn't know where to begin picking up the pieces. The first few days were filled with shock. He couldn't quite process what had happened. He had been loyal to the restaurant for years. He had built his reputation from the ground up. All of that felt like it had vanished in an instant. As he tried to return to normal life, it felt as if he was a ghost, disconnected from everything around him. His phone sat silent on the table, the only messages being well-meaning but hollow texts from friends and family expressing their sympathy. "It'll be okay, you'll find something else soon." But he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper had happened, something more personal, more unfair than anyone realized. The money from the severance check ran out quicker than he expected. He'd always lived modestly, but now, every expense felt like a mountain to climb. The bills kept coming, the rent was due, and yet, there were no job offers on the horizon. The restaurant industry was a tight-knit world, and he knew from experience that it wasn't easy to break into a new kitchen once you'd been out of work for even a short time. He had been let go under mysterious circumstances, and he had no idea how to explain it to a potential new employer. Even worse, he felt ashamed. Every time he thought about going out and looking for work, a sinking feeling crawled into his chest. What would he say? How could he explain to anyone that he had been fired for no reason? Would they believe him? Would they think he was unworthy, lazy, or incompetent? The very idea of facing rejection again made him feel sick. He tried to take up small side jobs, anything to pay the bills. He cooked meals for friends, helped cater small events, but nothing seemed to stick. He couldn't find anything permanent. Every job interview felt like a reminder of his failure, and every rejection cut deeper than the last. His confidence, once so solid, had been shaken. He couldn't help but replay the moment of the firing over and over in his mind. He had tried to be calm, tried to understand. But the words kept echoing, "It's just business, nothing personal." How could it not be personal? How could something so sudden, so unprovoked, not be personal? One night, while he was sitting in his small, dimly lit kitchen, scrolling through his phone in search of another job listing, he had a moment of clarity. The frustration, the confusion, the anger, it all started to swirl into a single thought: what if this wasn't about him at all? What if this wasn't just bad luck or poor timing? What if the reason behind his firing was something deeper, something he couldn't even begin to understand? Was there something he wasn't seeing? As the days passed, that nagging question took hold of him. It gnawed at the edges of his mind, refusing to let go. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something that no one was talking about. Maybe it wasn't just business. Maybe it was something personal. But what? What had he done to deserve this? Was it really just because of money, or was there something else that no one was saying? In the quiet of the night, he began to wonder, was race a factor? He had always worked with pride, giving everything to his job, but had that really been enough? Was there an invisible line he couldn't see, a boundary he didn't even know existed? He couldn't know for sure, but the thought lingered in his mind, a quiet suspicion that felt impossible to ignore. The next day, the chef did something he hadn't done before. He started digging into the restaurant's history. He didn't have proof, no evidence that race had played a role in his firing, but there had to be something. Some pattern. Some reason. He called a few former coworkers, asking them about the owner's decisions, about anything that had changed in the months leading up to his dismissal. He didn't get far. Most of his old colleagues had either been let go or had moved on to other jobs. He couldn't get anyone to tell him what really happened. But one former colleague, someone who had worked in the kitchen for years, had a few words of caution. Sometimes, things happen, man. Sometimes you don't get the full picture. Maybe you don't want to know what goes on behind the scenes. The cryptic message only deepened the chef's unease. What did that even mean? What was going on behind the scenes? Why was everything so shrouded in secrecy? With each unanswered question, the chef felt himself sinking deeper into a hole. His self-doubt, the weight of his failure, and the endless uncertainty were taking their toll. He wasn't just losing his job, he was losing himself. What had happened to the confident, capable man who had once run that kitchen with pride? Where had he gone? Would he ever find his way back? But something else was stirring inside him too. A desire. A need to know the truth. He couldn't move forward until he understood what had really happened. He couldn't let this story end without knowing the answers. The chef decided he wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let the mystery fester inside him. He would find out the truth, even if it took months. Even if it cost him everything. He had to know what happened. He had to know why he had been fired. And he had to face it, whatever it was, before he could ever move on. The chef spent the next several weeks in a haze of frustration, turning over the events of the past in his mind again and again. Each day, he felt further from the confident, capable man he used to be. No answers were coming, and every attempt to dig deeper only left him more confused. He couldn't help but replay that moment in the office, the way the owner had avoided his eyes, the coldness in his voice. There was no explanation, no remorse. He'd been let go like a mere cog in a machine, one that could be replaced without a second thought. But this wasn't just about losing a job. It was about dignity, respect, and a sudden, inexplicable betrayal that had left him reeling. His mind kept returning to one question: why? There had to be something. A clue. A reason. If the firing had been purely business, why hadn't the owner at least given him a chance to explain himself, to fix whatever had gone wrong? He had always done his job well. The customers had always praised his food, his technique, his passion for the craft. So why was he suddenly seen as expendable? He started asking around, discreetly, of course. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself. He had learned that people in the restaurant world could be unforgiving, especially when it came to internal matters. But if he wanted answers, he knew he had to dig. He reached out to a few old colleagues who had moved on to other kitchens. Some were kind enough to lend him their time, but none could offer any concrete explanations. A couple of them had heard rumors about financial issues within the restaurant, but none of them could confirm anything. It seemed as though the owner had pulled back from talking to anyone. The more the chef tried to reach out, the more walls seemed to go up. One afternoon, he ran into an old sous chef outside of a grocery store. The man had worked with him for several years at the restaurant, and they'd shared more than a few late-night shifts. He was someone the chef trusted, someone who had always seemed to be in the know about the ins and outs of the restaurant. They exchanged pleasantries before the chef finally asked, "What happened? Do you know why I was fired?" The sous chef hesitated, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. After a long pause, he leaned in close, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't want to get involved, but there's something you need to know." He stopped himself, clearly conflicted. The owner was under a lot of pressure. He'd been making some bad business deals, trying to save face. "But I don't think you were the real reason." The chef felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean?" The sous chef glanced nervously around again. "Let's just say, the owner's decisions were more about protecting himself than about the staff. I don't know for sure, but he might have made you the scapegoat." A scapegoat. The word hit the chef like a punch to the gut. He had been fired because of someone else's failure. The thought stirred a mixture of anger and disbelief inside him. How could the owner do that? How could he throw someone else under the bus to save himself? But then, a more troubling thought took root. What if it wasn't just about business? What if there was more at play? The chef couldn't help but wonder, was there something personal involved? Something deeper than just financial strain? He had been in the restaurant world long enough to know that sometimes, decisions were made behind closed doors, decisions that weren't always fair or just. But race? He couldn't help but ask himself if that had played a role. As the days dragged on, the chef's suspicions grew. It was impossible not to wonder. He had never felt out of place at the restaurant, but now, looking back, he questioned everything. Had there been moments where he had been treated differently? Had the owner said or done things that, in hindsight, seemed like subtle indications of something darker? But there were no answers to these questions. Not yet. One evening, he sat in his small apartment, sifting through old files, receipts, and records from his time at the restaurant. He had never been one to keep detailed notes, but he remembered the major events, the promotions, the projects he'd worked on. His mind wandered back to the moments when he'd felt proud of what he'd accomplished, times when he thought he had earned respect, not just as a worker, but as a person. But none of that seemed to matter now. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the firing wasn't about his performance, wasn't about his work ethic. He was no longer certain that he would ever know the full truth. But one thing was becoming painfully clear: the more he searched for answers, the more it felt like he was facing a wall that couldn't be climbed, a mystery that might never be solved. The uncertainty was eating him alive. As he sat there, staring at the walls of his apartment, the weight of it all came crashing down on him. The career he had built, the friendships he had forged, everything seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He was losing control, losing himself in the process. And no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he searched for answers, he wasn't sure how to find his way out of this abyss. Just as the chef began to sink deeper into despair, life offered him a sliver of hope. It came unexpectedly, as life often does, in the form of a phone call. His phone buzzed one quiet morning, its screen lighting up with the name of an old colleague, someone he hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey," the voice on the other end said, a familiar warmth in the tone. "I heard about what happened. I'm really sorry, man. That's messed up." The chef felt a pang in his chest at the mention of the firing. He had tried to put it out of his mind, but it always lingered, like an open wound that never healed. "Yeah, it's been tough," he replied, trying to sound casual. The old colleague, who had worked as a line cook alongside him, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Listen, I don't know if you're still looking, but there's a spot opening up at a new place. The head chef is a friend of mine, and he's looking for someone he can trust. I told him about you. He might be interested." The chef's heart skipped a beat. A real opportunity, something tangible, something that could pull him out of this rut. The restaurant world was a small one, and to get an offer like this, especially after everything that had happened, felt like a miracle. "I don't know," the chef hesitated. He had been so burned by the last experience that the idea of jumping back into another kitchen felt daunting. Could he handle the pressure again? Could he put himself through another cycle of hope and rejection? But the idea of staying stuck in the pit of uncertainty was worse. "Come on, just hear him out. Worst case, you say no. But I think this could be a good fit for you," the colleague urged. And just like that, the seed of hope was planted. The chef agreed to meet the head chef at the new restaurant. He wasn't sure what to expect, but a part of him knew this was his chance to move on, to rebuild. Maybe it wouldn't be the same as before. Maybe it wouldn't be the perfect kitchen, but it was a step forward, a chance to prove to himself that he wasn't done yet. The day of the interview, the chef dressed carefully. It was strange to be in front of someone again after so many weeks of feeling invisible. As he walked into the restaurant, the sleek, modern decor stood in stark contrast to the familiar, worn-in atmosphere of the restaurant he had been fired from. The kitchen was quieter, more polished. There was a calm professionalism in the air that he hadn't been used to in a while. It was a breath of fresh air. The head chef, a middle-aged man with a warm smile, greeted him with a firm handshake. The chef felt the immediate sense of respect. He hadn't realized he missed so much. They sat down, and the conversation flowed naturally. The head chef didn't seem to care about the chef's past, he was more interested in what he could bring to the table now. "This place is about more than just food," the head chef said. "It's about a team. We're not just creating meals, we're creating an experience for our customers. You can't do that without trust. I hear you've got that in spades. We need someone like you." The chef felt a rush of gratitude. He had almost forgotten what it was like to feel valued, to be appreciated for the work he did. This wasn't like the cold dismissal he had experienced before. This was different, this was a fresh start. The interview ended with a handshake, and the head chef promised to get back to him soon. As the chef walked out of the restaurant, a wave of relief washed over him. It wasn't a guarantee yet, but it felt like a real chance. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to turn around. He called his family and friends to share the news. Their excitement for him was palpable, and it felt good to be the one delivering the positive update for once. The chef didn't know if this new job would work out, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope flicker within him. In the weeks that followed, the chef worked hard to prepare for the potential new chapter in his life. He studied new techniques, sharpened his knives, and made sure to keep a positive mindset, even when doubts crept in. He had learned, the hard way, that life could turn on a dime. But what mattered now was how he responded to it. He had been through so much in such a short time. His world had crumbled, but now, he was starting to rebuild it piece by piece. He couldn't erase the past, couldn't undo the hurt, but he could control what happened next. And he was determined to make the most of this second chance. Then, one afternoon, he received the call. The head chef wanted him on the team. The chef felt a rush of relief. It wasn't just a job, it was a moment of redemption, a chance to prove that he still had the skill, the passion, and the drive to succeed. It was also a reminder that even in the darkest times, there could be light at the end of the tunnel. The road to recovery was never going to be easy, but at least now, he knew he was on the right path. The chef's return to the restaurant world wasn't as simple as walking into a new kitchen and immediately fitting in. The weight of the past followed him, like an invisible shadow that lingered in every corner of his mind. It was hard to ignore the feelings of betrayal that still clung to him, the uncertainty about whether he had truly been let go for the right reasons. The questions about his firing weren't just going to disappear, no matter how much he focused on the present. He couldn't help but wonder if he would ever get the answers he so desperately sought. As the weeks passed, he threw himself into his work at the new restaurant. His colleagues were kind and welcoming, and the head chef seemed to trust him right away. He had regained his confidence, at least, in the kitchen. The hours flew by, and the chef's talent was once again on full display. His work, as always, spoke for itself. Yet, despite the success he was finding, there was something nagging at him. The more he immersed himself in his new job, the more he learned about the restaurant industry in the area, and about the owner who had fired him. He discovered that the restaurant he had once worked for wasn't in great shape. It was barely staying afloat, and it seemed like the owner was struggling to keep the business going. His decisions were becoming increasingly erratic, and he was lashing out at those closest to him in an effort to protect his reputation. The chef learned through whispers and rumors that the firing wasn't just a business decision, it was a scapegoat maneuver. The owner had been losing money for months and needed someone to blame. He had picked the chef, knowing full well that he had been one of the strongest workers, and made him the fall guy for problems that had nothing to do with him. The chef's stomach turned as he realized just how manipulative the situation had been. His mind raced. The owner had treated him as expendable, without ever considering the consequences of his actions. And now, months later, the chef could see how it had all unfolded. The restaurant was still teetering on the edge, and it seemed like the owner was just grasping at straws to stay afloat. But there was more. Through a series of conversations with old coworkers, the chef uncovered a piece of information that stopped him in his tracks. The owner had been under investigation for unethical practices. Some of the restaurant's financial decisions had been questioned, and it seemed like the owner was attempting to cover up his missteps by pushing blame onto others. The chef, it turned out, wasn't the only person to be let go for reasons that didn't make sense. A wave of anger surged through the chef. For months, he had been struggling with the idea that he had done something wrong, that he had been cast aside without cause. He had spent sleepless nights replaying the firing in his head, trying to figure out what he had done to deserve it. But now, as he pieced everything together, it was clear that he had been nothing more than a pawn in the owner's game. It would have been easy to think about revenge. The chef had every reason to seek some form of justice. He could go public, talk to the media, share his side of the story. Maybe he could expose the owner for what he had done. He could make sure that everyone knew what had really happened, how the owner had used him as a scapegoat to save his own reputation. But as the chef sat in his small apartment, stewing over the details, he realized something. Revenge wouldn't give him peace. It wouldn't undo the past or change the situation. If anything, it would keep him tied to a toxic chapter of his life. It would keep the hurt alive, feeding the fire of anger and bitterness. Was that what he really wanted? To live in the shadow of that day, to let it consume him for the rest of his life? He thought about it long and hard. Revenge might have felt good in the moment, but justice, true justice, was about something more. It was about moving forward with integrity, about reclaiming his life and his dignity, not letting his past dictate his future. Instead of seeking revenge, the chef made a decision. He would rise above it all. He would not let the actions of a flawed man control his destiny. The restaurant world was filled with challenges, and he had proven that he could overcome them. He would keep his focus on his career, on the things that mattered most, his work, his passion for cooking, and the people who respected him for his skills, not for his past. But even with that clarity, a part of him couldn't let go of the idea of confronting the owner, of confronting the person who had destroyed his livelihood without a second thought. He wrestled with the idea of facing the man who had thrown him away. Was it worth it? Would it make a difference? In the end, the chef knew that the best revenge was not revenge at all. The best revenge was living well, moving forward with his head held high, and continuing to do what he loved. The owner's actions didn't define him, his response to those actions did. And so, with a newfound sense of peace, the chef set his sights on the future. He would build his career again, brick by brick. He would prove to himself, and to everyone who had ever doubted him, that he was more than the sum of his setbacks. He would rise again, stronger and wiser than before. 6 months after the chef had been fired, the last thing he expected was a call from the very man who had unceremoniously ended his career. His phone buzzed one late afternoon, startling him as he was working at the new restaurant. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. It was the owner of the old restaurant, the one who had let him go without explanation. For a moment, the chef stared at the phone, his thoughts racing. He hadn't heard from the owner since that fateful day. The chef had tried to put the entire ordeal behind him, and he was well into his second chance, slowly rebuilding his career. The last thing he wanted was to drag himself back into that mess. Still, curiosity gnawed at him. He picked up the phone. "Hello?" he answered, his voice guarded. "Hey, it's me, from the restaurant," the owner said, sounding almost apologetic. "I know it's been a while, but I wanted to talk. Can we meet?" The chef felt a mixture of disbelief and hesitation. What could he possibly want now? "I'm not sure what this is about," the chef replied, his tone cautious. "I've moved on, I'm fine where I am." "I understand, but I need to explain something," the owner said quickly. "Please, just meet me. I owe you that much." The chef was silent for a moment. Everything inside him screamed not to go, not to reopen that painful chapter. But some part of him couldn't resist. Maybe, just maybe, he would finally get the answers he had been longing for. He agreed to meet. The meeting was set for the following afternoon at a quiet cafe in town. As the chef walked into the cafe, he saw the owner sitting at a corner table, looking uncomfortable and out of place in the casual setting. There was no bravado, no airs of superiority. Just a man who seemed burdened, weighed down by something the chef couldn't quite place. He sat down across from the owner, who immediately looked up with a heavy sigh. The chef could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. He hadn't expected this to be easy, but he hadn't expected this level of discomfort either. "Look, I owe you an explanation," the owner began, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I don't know how else to say it, but I made a huge mistake." The chef raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I fired you," the owner continued, "and I did it for all the wrong reasons. You didn't deserve it. I didn't have a choice, but I should have been honest with you." The chef's mind was spinning. No choice? What could he possibly mean by that? He leaned forward, his patience growing thin. "What are you talking about?" the chef asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What do you mean you didn't have a choice? You had no reason to fire me, no warning. I was one of your best employees." The owner nodded slowly, his face filled with regret. "I know. And I'm sorry. The truth is, I was under a lot of pressure. The restaurant was struggling. There were financial issues, and I was trying to save face with the investors. It wasn't about you. But I couldn't see it at the time. I made you the scapegoat. I thought it would solve everything. I thought it would save my reputation." The chef felt his breath catch in his throat. Scapegoat. The word echoed in his mind, but hearing it from the owner's lips made it all too real. The chef had suspected this, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch in the gut. The whole ordeal had been about money, about the owner's desperation to cover his own failures. "I understand now that I messed up," the owner continued, his voice trembling slightly. "And I'm sorry. I should have been upfront with you, should have been honest. I hurt you for no reason, and I've been living with that guilt ever since." For a moment, the chef was silent. His mind was reeling. He had spent so many nights questioning himself, wondering what he had done wrong. He had blamed himself for months, but now the truth was laid out before him. It wasn't about his work. It wasn't about his performance. It was never about him. The chef had been caught in a whirlwind of the owner's failures. The anger the chef had carried with him for months suddenly felt hollow. The rage, the frustration, the need for revenge, it all seemed so irrelevant now. The real answer was clear: the owner was a man who had been consumed by his own mistakes, trying to salvage his reputation at the cost of others. And in doing so, he had hurt the very person who had always given his best. "Why now?" the chef finally asked, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. "Why reach out now, after all this time?" The owner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I've lost everything. The restaurant is on the brink of closing down. And I realized that I can't keep running from what I did. I need to make it right, and I know I can't fix everything. But I can start by telling you the truth." The chef's mind churned. It wasn't the closure he had expected, not the apology he had imagined. There was no grand gesture, no compensation that could undo the damage done. And yet, as he sat there, listening to the owner's words, something within him shifted. "I don't know if anything will fix this," the chef said quietly. "But hearing this, it helps. I don't know if I'll ever trust you again, but at least I know the truth now." The owner nodded, as though he had expected this response. There was no further explanation, no attempt to make amends beyond what had already been said. It was clear that the chef didn't need anything more from him, he just needed the truth. And that was all the chef could ask for. As the chef left the cafe, he didn't feel the burning sense of justice he had once imagined. There was no triumph in confronting the past. But there was peace, a peace that came from finally understanding that the past couldn't be changed. It was a chapter that had been written, and it was time to turn the page. The chef took a deep breath as he stepped back into the sunlight. It wasn't over, but it was one step closer to being done. After that meeting with the owner, the chef felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, confusion, and even a sense of closure. But as the days passed, something deeper began to settle inside him. The weight of the past, which had been like a shadow hanging over him, didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. He had confronted it, heard the truth, and now it was time to decide what came next. The decision loomed large in his mind: should he return to the restaurant where it all started, where the betrayal had taken place? The offer had been made. The owner had extended an olive branch, asking the chef to come back, to put the past behind them. But could he? Could he trust the place where he had been cast aside without warning? His heart was conflicted. A part of him wanted to accept the job, to return to the familiar kitchen, to show everyone that he hadn't been broken by the ordeal. It was a tempting thought, to walk back in with his head held high, knowing that he had the upper hand now. But another part of him, the wiser part, questioned whether going back would truly bring the peace he longed for. Was it worth risking everything again? The chef spent sleepless nights turning the possibility over in his mind. The old wounds hadn't healed yet. The thought of returning to the place where he had been humiliated, where his worth had been disregarded, was hard to swallow. He knew that he had learned valuable lessons since he left, lessons about resilience, self-worth, and the importance of moving forward. Was it wise to go back and reopen those wounds, just to prove a point? He leaned on the support of those who had stood by him. His family, his friends, his new colleagues, each of them had watched him struggle and rise again, and each one had their own perspective on what he should do. Some said it was time to forgive, to go back and take the opportunity. "You deserve that closure," one of his friends had said. "It's not about them, it's about you, and what you can prove to yourself." Others, though, felt differently. They reminded him of the emotional toll the whole experience had taken. "You've got a fresh start now," another friend had said. "You don't need that place anymore. Don't let it define you." The chef couldn't shake the thought that returning to the old restaurant wasn't just about getting back to work. It was about something deeper, a need for validation, a desire for closure. He wanted to prove that he wasn't weak, that he hadn't been broken. But as the days wore on, he started to realize something important: true strength wasn't in going back, it was in moving forward. His value wasn't tied to any single place or person. It was defined by how he carried himself, by the choices he made after everything had fallen apart. And so, the chef made his decision. He wouldn't go back. The old restaurant was a chapter in his story, but it didn't have to be the defining chapter. He had already made his mark, and he didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, not to the owner, not to his former colleagues, and not even to himself. Instead, he would continue to build on what he had started at the new restaurant. He would pour himself into his work with the same passion he always had, but this time, with the knowledge that he had come through the storm stronger and wiser. This was where he belonged now, not in the shadow of the past, but in the present, where he was appreciated for his talent, not his history. That evening, as the chef stood in the kitchen of his new restaurant, chopping vegetables and preparing the evening's menu, a sense of peace settled over him. The sharp knife in his hand moved with precision, the rhythm of the kitchen becoming a comforting hum around him. He had found his place. He had found his footing again. And this time, he was ready to face whatever came next, on his own terms. He wasn't looking back anymore. The past had shaped him, yes, but it no longer had the power to define him. The future was his to create. As the night went on, the kitchen filled with the smells of delicious food, the clink of plates being set, and the hum of the restaurant in full swing. The chef's heart swelled with pride as he watched his team work together seamlessly, just as he had dreamed. He was part of something bigger now, a team, a family, one that valued him not for his past mistakes, but for the person he was today. And as the night drew to a close, the chef couldn't help but smile. He had made the right decision. He had faced the past, learned from it, and had walked away stronger. His story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The chef's decision to stay and build a future in the new restaurant wasn't easy. Every day, the past tried to creep back into his thoughts, reminding him of the hurt, the confusion, the betrayal. But with each passing shift, with every plate he plated, the weight of his former life began to lift. He found solace in the kitchen, in the rhythm of the work, in the camaraderie of his new colleagues. They respected him not just for his skill, but for the quiet strength he had shown in overcoming adversity. But still, something lingered in the back of his mind. The offer from the old restaurant, while he had chosen not to accept it, had left a sense of unfinished business. The idea of going back, even just to confront the owner one last time, tugged at him. Was there something more to be gained from confronting his past? Could he finally have the closure he needed, or would that just reopen old wounds? He wasn't sure. As he stood in the kitchen one evening, stirring a sauce on the stove, his phone buzzed again. He checked the screen, half expecting another call from someone offering a job. Half expecting another call from someone offering a job opportunity, or maybe just another well-meaning check-in from a friend or family member. But this time it was different. It was a message from the owner of the old restaurant. The one who had fired him. I know I don't deserve your time, but I'm asking for one last chance to make things right. Please meet me. I need to apologize in person. The chef felt his stomach tighten. He had already made his decision, hadn't he? He had already walked away from that chapter, let it go, and chosen to focus on the present. So why was he even considering meeting the man who had caused him so much pain? The message lingered on the screen, like an invitation to step back into the past. For a moment, he hesitated. His first instinct was to ignore it, to let it fade away as just another desperate plea from someone who hadn't fully realized the consequences of their actions. But the longer he looked at it, the more he felt the pull to meet with him. What would it hurt? He wasn't going back to the restaurant. He wasn't returning to the place where he had been wronged. But could this meeting, this final interaction, give him the peace he needed to move on completely? He didn't know. But deep down, he understood that it wasn't about forgiveness, it was about closure. He couldn't carry the weight of this unresolved chapter with him forever. He needed to see it for what it was, face it head-on, and close the door for good. After a long pause, he typed a simple response, "Fine. I'll meet you." They agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop downtown the following afternoon. As he prepared for the meeting, the chef found himself caught between emotions, part of him eager to understand the owner's motives, to hear him explain himself, the other part dreading the emotional toll the conversation might take. The next day, he arrived at the coffee shop early, sitting by the window, waiting for the familiar face to appear. As he sipped his coffee, the chef reflected on how much had changed. 6 months ago, he had been at his lowest point, unsure of his future, questioning his worth. But now, as he sat there, he knew one thing for certain: he had rebuilt his life. His work was solid, his new team respected him, and his passion for cooking had only grown stronger. He didn't need the old restaurant. He had everything he needed in the here and now. When the door opened, the chef looked up to see the owner walk in, his face weary, but with a look of genuine remorse. The man hesitated for a moment before walking toward the table, and when he sat down, there was no bravado, no defenses. He seemed like a man broken by his own mistakes, weighed down by guilt. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," the owner began, his voice low. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve that. But I've realized that I can't move forward without apologizing. I ruined your career, your reputation, and for what? To save face? It was selfish. You didn't deserve any of it. I should have been honest with you from the start." The chef listened, feeling the tension in his chest slowly ease. He had never expected this kind of humility. It wasn't the apology he had imagined when the fire of anger was still burning in him. It was something deeper, an honest attempt at redemption. "I don't need your apology," the chef said quietly. "I've moved on. I've worked hard to put everything behind me. And I've found something better." The owner nodded, as though understanding completely. "I get it. I don't expect you to come back to the restaurant. But I needed to say this, to you, to myself. I was wrong, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. I'm just sorry. The chef sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of the conversation. He had expected anger, resentment, even justification. But this? This was something he hadn't anticipated, a man finally acknowledging the harm he had caused, without any excuses, without any attempt to shift the blame. I appreciate you saying that, the chef said at last. But I've got my own path now. And it's leading me forward, not back. I've got work to do. But thank you for finally being honest with me. The meeting ended quietly. There were no grand gestures, no emotional reconciliations. But there was peace. The past had been laid bare, the truth spoken, and the chapter was now closed. As the chef walked out of the coffee shop and into the street, he felt lighter, freer than he had in months. The decision to stay where he was, to build something new, to leave the old restaurant behind, he knew it had been the right one. And now, finally, there was nothing left to hold him back. The days following the meeting were filled with a sense of clarity the chef hadn't realized he was missing. For months, he had carried the weight of that unanswered question: why had he been fired? Why had someone he respected turned his back on him with no explanation? Now, the question no longer mattered. He had faced the truth, heard the apology he needed to hear, and he could finally move forward. The chef spent his days immersed in his work, but with a new perspective. He no longer saw each shift as a struggle to prove himself or as a means to regain something he had lost. Instead, he saw it as a chance to do what he loved, to create something meaningful, and to build a future for himself that was founded on his own abilities and integrity. The restaurant had become a place of growth for him, not just as a chef, but as a person. He worked with an openness now, a sense of humility he hadn't had before. He understood, more than ever, that life was unpredictable, that the future could change in the blink of an eye. He had been on the receiving end of a betrayal, but he had also learned that no situation could ever define his worth unless he allowed it. One evening, after the dinner rush had settled down, the chef found himself standing at the front of the restaurant, looking out at the city through the windows. He watched the traffic pass by, the people going about their lives, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly at peace. His past had shaped him, but it no longer controlled him. The lessons he had learned, about resilience, forgiveness, and moving forward, had taken root in his heart. He had been knocked down, but he had never stayed down. He had worked harder than ever to rebuild his life, and each step forward felt like a victory. As he turned back toward the kitchen, the chef noticed the staff working together, the kitchen filled with a sense of harmony. He had earned their respect, and they had earned his. He wasn't just a cook anymore, he was part of a family, part of something bigger than himself. He realized that life wasn't about waiting for the past to change or for the world to make up for the mistakes others had made. It was about how you handled the setbacks, how you responded to the challenges, and how you chose to rise above them. The chef had learned that, no matter what life threw at him, he had the power to control his own story. His journey had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. The bitterness and anger that had once consumed him no longer had a place in his life. The apology from the owner had been important, but even more so, the decision to forgive, whether or not the owner deserved it, had been the key to freeing himself from the past. As the night wore on, the chef felt a sense of satisfaction as he put the final touches on the evening's menu. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about the journey, the lessons learned, and the strength found in the face of adversity. And with that, the chef realized that he was exactly where he needed to be. He wasn't just surviving. He was thriving.